So what happened after 1865 was that there was no redistribution of land towards the freed people, contrary to the promises of 40 acres and a mule, contrary to the hopes of actually becoming a yeoman class of farmers. The land remained in the hands of the planter class. And so what you had after 1865 was a kind of economic dilemma in which all the land, the property that was necessary in order to produce cotton and other crops, remained in the hands of wealthy whites, and yet the labor consisted of freed people who were no longer, at least nominally under the law, enslaved. And so the solution, the compromise, was something that was known as sharecropping. So no longer were the freed people slaves, no longer were they chattel property. They were now the tenants of a white landlord class. So the white landlords had land, they had capital, they had the machinery necessary in order to produce cotton and other crops, but they lacked labor. And on the other hand, the freedmen, the African Americans, had labor, but they lacked land. And so they entered into sharecropping agreements, effectively contracts, with white landowners in which they paid their rents through a share of their crops. So they might promise 1/3 or 1/4, or even in some extreme cases, 1/2 of all the cotton they produced to their landlords. So the landlords would provide them with the land, they might advance them machinery, they might advance them some seeds, and they would give them the right to use the land. In exchange, the tenants were now expected to pay a share of their crops. The landlords often such a high rate that they effectively became indebted. They would work year after year after year and never be put in a position where they would have enough money or enough wealth in order to buy land in their own right. So effectively, they were a captive laboring class of their white landlords. Now, in some ways, it might seem like not much better than slavery. In many ways, it wasn't. On the other hand, you can sort of see from this image of a plantation in Georgia owned by the Barrow family in Oglethorpe County, that the layout of these plantations began to change. So on the image on the left, you have a road that crosses through it. You have the slave quarters and the master's house closely grouped together next to the road, a gin house across the way. That would be the place where people would process the cotton. So it's very much a system in which the owner, which the slave owner, is at the center of an economic empire, a kind of feudal domain that's owned by the master. Take a look then at the image on the right. So this is after emancipation. This is in 1881. So this is after the Civil War, after the 13th Amendment. And you notice that now the slave quarters no longer exist. That the houses are distributed across the entire estate. You've got a church, you've got a school on the left, and then you also notice the names. Okay, so if you look along the map, on the left you see an image of the plantation, names of certain individuals. There'd be Frank Maxey, there'd be Jim Reed, there'd be Nancy Pope, there'd be Willis Bryant, Tom Wright. Each family would have their own house separate from one another. They'd each have a claim to a particular patch of land, and they would be working that patch of land. So it's less dominated by the planters. There's more of an ability of the freed people to form their own communities, but still it's a very grinding form of economic exploitation. It becomes a system through which the tenants are trapped in generations of cyclical poverty because of this need to pay off the debts that are incurred through the sharecropping arrangements they form with the planters. As well, the white elite use other methods of finding ways to exploit labor, including convict leasing. So slavery is abolished as a result of the 13th Amendment, but the 13th Amendment also has a loophole which allows servitude to exist in cases of people who have been convicted of felonies. So what happens is in southern states, the enforcement laws becomes especially stringent in relation to African Americans. So there are a whole range of crimes that become subject to extreme punishments, anything from stealing hogs to vagrancy. And so once people are arrested, they're put on trial, they're convicted, this allows them to be auctioned off effectively as slaves. So there are thousands of freed African Americans who are effectively re-enslaved as a result of convict leasing. They're used to build roads, they're used in the manufacturing industry in places like Birmingham, Alabama, and convict labor, which is effectively a new form of slavery, becomes an important dimension of the economy of the New South. So on one hand, you have this reaction against the new economic power of the freed people, but in many ways that's not considered enough on the part of white Southerners. They want to reestablish dominance, and they see the radical Republicans as their enemies. They see the radical Republicans as an occupying power, and they are determined to both fight against the power of the Northern Republicans, but also to reassert their position as the dominant ruling race of the South. And so what happens from 1860s onward, you have this concerted move by white Southerners, effectively by methods of terror, to reassert their power in the South. In the view of white Southerners, the Reconstruction governments were illegitimate. So not only did they view the notion of African Americans having political rights as outrageous, they also viewed the white allies of the African Americans as their enemies. So on one hand, they used the term scalawags to refer to Unionist Republican whites. So these would be often poor whites who would have sided with Republican governments, Reconstruction governments, because they saw those governments as perhaps new political forms of authority to be more responsive to their rights and to their interests. You also had a number of Northerners who had come down to the South after the Civil War, sometimes to start up businesses, also sometimes for idealistic reasons, to start schools, to engage in reforms. They were derided as carpetbaggers. So carpetbaggers, sort of the image was of someone with his possessions on his back coming down to rob the South of its wealth. And so from the point of view of white Southerners, you had this unholy alliance between scalawags, carpetbaggers, and freed people that threatened to overturn the proper order of the South, in which whites were at the top and African Americans were a servile laboring class. And so what happens from 1866 onward is you have a concerted effort by whites to reassert their authority, typically by using the methods of terror, of paramilitary action. So they actually formed a number of paramilitary groups, the most famous of which was the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan was formed in 1866 in Tennessee. One of its leading lights early on was Nathan Bedford Forrest, so the former slave trader who had become a cavalry leader general in the Confederate Army, who'd been responsible for the Fort Pillow Massacre. He became one of the leading figures of the Ku Klux Klan, which was a paramilitary association, a fraternal association as well, in which white Southerners would use intimidation, violence, torture, in order to discourage African Americans from exercising their civil rights, but also to terrorize sympathetic whites, whether they were Republican poor whites or they were Northerners who were coming down to protect the rights of African Americans. The Ku Klux Klan was only one of many associations. So you also had the red shirts, you had the white liners. So in fact, the white line became an expression for white supremacist Democrats who used every weapon in their arsenal in order to reassert the supremacy of whites. So in the early stages of radical Reconstruction, this was typically a method of preventing African Americans from voting, or preventing sympathetic whites from establishing governments that might grant or protect rights to African Americans. In response to the terrorism and violence that spreads through the South by the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist organizations, the federal government, in fact, initially takes action in order to protect the rights of African Americans. So in 1870, 1871, Congress passes a series of 3 acts known as the Enforcement Acts. So under the Enforcement Acts, the federal government now has the authority to arrest anyone who is preventing citizens from exercising their civil rights or their right to vote. And so this leads, in fact, to the arrest of hundreds of southern whites who were involved in the Ku Klux Klan. In some ways, it really cripples the Ku Klux Klan in certain southern states. By the way, in the states where the Ku Klux Klan is most active is states where you have a black majority. So places like South Carolina, places like Louisiana, places like Alabama, places like Mississippi, where if you actually let democracy run its course, you're going to have governments that represent the interests of the majority of the population who are African American. So the only way in which whites can reassert their supremacy, reassert their dominance, is through violence, is through terrorism. And so the Enforcement Acts allow the federal government briefly to crack down on the use of terrorism by the Ku Klux Klan and other paramilitary organizations as a way of reasserting, or asserting for the first time, the civil rights of African Americans. So you have a couple of years, sort of the high tide of Reconstruction, in which the federal government, through the use of the military, through the use of federal legislation, is in fact protecting the rights of African Americans. You have African Americans who are serving in state governments, in local governments, even in the federal government, even in the Senate. The tide, however, starts to turn in 1872 and 1873. So a couple things happened. On one hand, Northern opinion becomes less and less favorable towards Reconstruction, especially the use of federal force, the use of federal funds in order to protect the rights of African Americans. Sympathies for black people in the North had never been very strong, certainly outside of the abolitionist strongholds of the Northeast and in Massachusetts and New England. By 1872, there was growing opposition within the Republican Party to the continued use of federal troops in order to protect the rights of African Americans. So in fact, you have a wing of the Republican Party known as the Liberal Republicans who are opposed to Ulysses S. Grant. They don't like Ulysses S. Grant's use of patronage. They accuse him of corruption. So they're personally opposed to Grant, but they're also in opposition to the continued use of federal troops in the South. I mean, liberal in this sense means laissez-faire. They want to keep the government as minimal as possible, and they feel that Reconstruction, radical Reconstruction, is a misuse of federal funds. So Horace Greeley, the publisher of the New York Tribune, who'd actually been a strong advocate of abolition before the war, becomes a presidential candidate as a liberal Republican, as a way of opposing Ulysses S. Grant and opposing the cause of radical Reconstruction. So on one hand, you have a political move in the North against the cause of Reconstruction. And then the subsequent year, 1873, you also have an economic downturn, in fact, an economic crisis. So in 1873, you have a crash of the stock market. Prices fall, land values fall. You enter into a prolonged period of economic depression. So Northerners, as well as Southerners, are feeling the economic pinch, and they're much less sympathetic to the cause of African Americans.